Today, December 2020 marks the 89th birthday of Badruddin Umar. Who is Badruddin Umar? Our foremost Marxist, theorist, activist, historian, and educationist, and our most fearlessly vocal intellectual, Badruddin Umar serves as an example of how commitment, conviction, courage, and a cause, or how gnosis and praxis come to inform, influence, and inflect one another in the service of our people's struggle for liberation. Thus, Umar can be readily identified as an exceptional figure in Bangladesh, in a peripheral third world formation like Bangladesh, where the mainstream political culture, to use Umar's own words, the lumpen bourgeois political culture, has not only revealed its characteristic hollowness and ideological bankruptcy, but also is decidedly and incurably anti-people character and content. Of course, Umar himself has already theorized with superb rigor the formation of the national ruling classes in Bangladesh, suggesting time and again to use a third world poet's voice from another context and another register that, I quote, "Progress is history's dirty joke," unquote. But Umar's own theoretical and analytical interventions, accompanied by his activism, uncompromisingly combative as they all are, characteristically call attention to the power and resources of people's movements and struggles for a revolutionary social transformation. It is Umar's firm contention, exemplified repeatedly in his massive corpus of written works, that none but the people themselves, not just a few leaders, not just a few individuals, but people themselves change and make a history. Thus proclaims Badruddin Umar with his characteristic ardentia verba. I quote Umar here, "Nothing can stop a people's movement once it erupts to change the course of human history," unquote. But who are the people for Badruddin Umar? And who are the people in Bangladesh at a time when the noisy mainstream political parties, high and even overdosing as they are on mere electoral agendas for grabbing power, have brutally relegated our people to a peripheral space and even reduced them to abstract numerical entities? For Umar, of course, the answer is distinctly pronounced and relentlessly relayed. The people in question are none but workers and peasants themselves. Workers and peasants themselves, while Umar is exceedingly attentive to the woman question as well as to ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities in Bangladesh. And those workers and peasants and women and linguistic and ethnic and religious minorities in Bangladesh precisely constitute the forces of history or the agents of change that have involved and engaged the entire horizon of Umar's work, in fact, his entire life. And indeed, that life is the life of a revolutionary, the life of a dedicated communist, alive as he has been to the deep specificities of his own local sites of struggles, while at the same time remaining attentive to issues and concerns that are global in scope and range, issues and concerns that continue to affect the lives of workers and peasants in the world at large. Umar is an internationalist. And today, on Badruddin Umar's birthday, I vividly recall what two of my favorite writers and my friends who are no longer in the world today kept saying about Umar. They are our leading fiction writer, Akhtar Zaman Ilyas, with whom I worked very closely at one point, and our powerful creative writer, thinker, Ahmad Safa, with whom I also worked at one point in the 1990s, in fact, in the mid 1990s. So Ilyas, who worked closely with Umar as well, of course, asserted with utmost enthusiasm. And I quote Akhtar Zaman Ilyas here in English translation: Umar has taught us how not to be communal. And it is Umar who has revealed to us the true meaning of work and struggle for a cause, unquote. Safa, in a different context, of course, in a different context, and in response to Umar's monumental multi-volume work on our language movement of 1952, I will return to this work later, commended Umar thus, and I quote Safa here: I am fortunate to be alive in the time of Badruddin Umar, the Umar of Purba Banglar Bhasha Andolon, unquote. I also recall my conversation with Azaz Ahmed, the Marxist theorist activist from India and the author of In Theory, who told me in Dhaka back in 1994, after he had met Umar briefly, I quote, Umar, an outstanding man, unquote. And after having read the text of his inaugural address delivered at an international conference held in Mumbai more than a decade back, some Filipina revolutionaries told me this: Umar speaks like a revolutionary. And I can cite numerous others. But it is unfortunate that his massive contributions notwithstanding, Umar's work has not yet been adequately evaluated. While of course, it is also perfectly understandable that Umar has a whole host of detractors at a time when anti-revolutionary and anti-liberation elements, including certain liberals, prevail and predominate with a vengeance in Bangladesh. Now, some quick biographical details. Badruddin Umar was born on December 20th in 1931 in the town of Bardhaman in West Bengal. He was educated at Dhaka and Oxford universities. In fact, he received his honors degree in philosophy, politics, and economics from Oxford. And Umar began his career as a university teacher. He first taught philosophy at Dhaka University on a temporary basis. And then in 1963, when he was only 32, Umar joined Rajshahi University as the founder chair of the Department of Political Science. He was also a founder of the Department of Sociology at the same university. His interdisciplinary intellectual background was thus formed at a relatively early stage of his career. And the mid-1960s marked the period, I should emphasize here, marked a period, a turbulent and heady period during which all kinds of decolonization and national liberation movements, mostly inspired by Marxist-Leninist principles, were taking shape and gathering momentum across Asia and Africa, during which Badruddin Umar made his interventions as a highly charged, historically grounded, and politically engaged writer with the publications of his remarkable, unparalleled trilogy, Sampradayikotha, in English translation, Communalism, published in 1966, Sanskritir Sankot, in English translation, The Crisis of Culture, published in 1967, and Sanskritik Sampradayikotha, in English translation, Cultural Communalism, published in 1969. It is important to emphasize that the three books I have just mentioned are all groundbreaking interventions that arguably, for the first time, acutely theorize, in our contexts, of course, the dialectics of the political valences of culture and the cultural vectors of politics vis-a-vis the communal forms of, vis-a-vis the phenomenal forms of communalism in our parts of the world. Indeed, no other theorist has broached the question of communalism while accentuating a historically specific interplay between colonialism and communalism itself in ways in which Badruddin Umar has done it. In short, Badruddin Umar is a first-rate, indeed an outstanding theorist of communalism in our part of the world. But to say that Umar is just a theorist of communalism in our specific context is by no means adequate. At a time when there was a strong need, that is to say in the 1960s, when there was a strong need for a theoretical framework within which Bengali nationalism could be grasped in all its possible configurations and contours, Umar's books in question also made significant intellectual contributions to the growth of Bengali nationalism itself. In fact, to call him an early theorist of Bengali nationalism is a certainly right move, I think, in the direction of characterizing at least part of his work. And indeed, it was during this very period that Umar's anti-colonial liberationist antagonism to the Pakistani government became increasingly pronounced and sharp. That antagonism prompted Umar to sacrifice his otherwise extremely promising, in fact, extraordinary university career, and to devote his entire time and even his entire life to his intended political work for the working class people and peasants in Bangladesh. This is indeed an exemplary story, and a rare one at that, of how an Oxford graduate and a university teacher radically transformed himself into a full-time political activist in the interest of the people themselves. I quote, the toiling masses in particular, unquote, as Umar would say. And Badruddin Umar realized early on that theory without practice is simply vacuous, empty. That Marxism without organizations is just academic hot air. In 1969, the fierce and uncompromising and determined Umar was already amply armed with Marxist theory, and who of course was by no means made to be a traditional intellectual in the Gramscian sense, joined the then East Pakistan Communist Party, Marxist-Leninist. Also from February 1970 to March 1971, Umar ably edited the mouthpiece of the East Pakistan Communist Party, Saptahik Ganashakti. Umar's editorial tour de force, his historic role for that matter, was immediately evident in a range of theoretical and historical issues he had traversed with unusual acumen and commendable political astuteness, particularly, if not exclusively, vis-a-vis the problems and prospects of communist movements in the then Pakistan. But during the Liberation War of 1971, Umar fiercely opposed the line of the party itself, submitting 2 historic documents. He soon resigned from the party. And since then, he has been involved in his uncompromising communist politics, of course, committed as he is to the democratic and socialist transformation of this class-divided society. Umar was president of both Bangladesh Krishak Federation, in English translation, Bangladesh Peasant Federation, and Bangladesh Lekhak Shibir, the country's oldest organization of progressive writers, intellectuals, and cultural activists. I can't help mentioning here that I myself was the general secretary of this particular organization, Bangladesh Lekhak Shibir, in the early 1990s. In fact, from the early 1990s to the mid 1990s. And I had the opportunity and privilege of working very closely with Badruddin Umar at that point. It was Umar who actually decisively shaped the dimension and direction of this particular organization, Bangladesh Lekhak Shibir. And today, Umar is president of Jatiyo Mukti Council, in English translation, National Liberation Council, and an active member of the Anti-Imperialist and Anti-Fascist Committee in Bangladesh. Unusually productive and prolific as he is, while noted for his intellectual and political energy, Badruddin Umar has hitherto authored more than 100 books and countless articles. The scale, scope, the range, the rigor, and the richness of his interests and engagements are simply staggering. And by no means do I claim to offer a comprehensive evaluation of Umar's wide-ranging work here, given particularly the limits or exigencies of time here. However, I intend to tabulate and underline only a few high points of his work rather quickly now. So, despite his extensive body of work, one can certainly tabulate at least some of Umar's characteristic, theoretical, and thematic preoccupations pursued to varying degrees over the last 6 decades, during which he has been exemplarily steadfast in his commitment to the democratic and socialist transformation of class society, a point that I couldn't help emphasizing earlier. Some of those preoccupations then come to embrace the class question in our part of the world, and for that matter, the historical formations of our ruling classes and other classes in Bangladesh, the theoretical questions of realpolitik or hard politics itself, informed as they all are by a Marxism-Leninism as a rich body of dialectically engaged and interventionist analytical apparatuses and practices, the political physics of mass movements, including peasant, working class, and national liberation movements themselves, the rise of a historically determinate form of fascism in India and in Bangladesh, and the demystifying and even devastating ideological critiques of the lumpen bourgeois political culture in Bangladesh. And this catalog, in fact, can be extended to include even more topics, other topics and issues as well. Those issues, for instance, include the political economy and culture of capitalism on both global and local scales, the problems and prospects of world socialist movements, as well as the problems and possibilities of reconstructing communist movements in Bangladesh, the phenomena of militarism and military dictatorships in the third world, the criminalization of politics, business, and even law itself, the politics, ideology, and political economy of education and pedagogy, education movements, the role of intellectuals and writers, the politics of culture and the culture of politics, the question of national culture, the language question as a mass politics, issues of religious, ethnic, linguistic minorities in Bangladesh and elsewhere, the woman question, even ecology and environment, certainly the entire political, economic, and cultural histories of the Indian subcontinent and Bangladesh, the credit fetishizing, poverty business of the world-famous micro-shudkhor, Dr. Muhammad Yunus, and of course, imperialism and within quote marks globalization in their various manifestations, including their historical and phenomenal forms. And indeed, one can keep lengthening this particular list, which is indeed far from being exhaustive, while citing numerous titles from Umar to account for his reach and range and even rigor of his engagements. And one can certainly cite his relatively recent work, his 2-volume work titled The Emergence of Bangladesh, brought out by Oxford University Press, a work that deals with the trajectories and histories of class struggles in our parts of the world since 1947, the genesis and growth and effects of Bengali nationalism, and of course, the rise of Bangladesh itself as a separate and sovereign nation state in the world. But any discussion Any discussion or overview of Umar's work is bound to remain unjustly inadequate without at least some attention to his monumental, path-breaking, 3-volume historiographical work called Purbo Banglar Bhasha Andolon o Totkalin Rajniti, in English translation, The Language Movement in East Bengal and Contemporary Politics. It is here where I think one can underline Badruddin Umar's contributions as a historian, as a historiographer. By the way, historiography here has to do with the very politics of writing its history itself. But to say that Umar is an important historian of our language movement is only a slender acknowledgement of his actual achievements. In fact, I think Badruddin Umar's contributions, primarily, if not exclusively, reside in mobilizing for the first time in our country a particular radical and organically sustained approach that views the history itself from below, or that recognizes the peoples themselves, workers and peasants in particular, as the true protagonists of history, running against the grain of traditional bourgeois, elitist, and colonialist historiographies. Umar's work for the first time, empirically, historically, and analytically reveals that the language movement is not just a movement of some middle-class leaders or enthusiasts, but a movement of the masses, a movement in which their liberationist and emancipatory consciousness manifested in some form. Umar himself puts the case thus, and I quote Umar, "The total character of the language movement was shaped by not only the aspirations and the struggles of the Bengali middle class, but also by the struggles of peasants, workers, and other sections of the working people. For this reason, the language movement contained elements both of bourgeois nationalism as well as the aspirations of the toiling masses. And this gave the language movement a certain democratic character, which remained unsurpassed during the subsequent political developments in East Bengal," unquote. Mark Umar's characteristic Marxist-Leninist accent, falling on the very question of totality itself, tempered by acute historical specificities and situational concreteness, qualities that indeed characterize most of his oeuvre, noted also as it is for clarity and cogency and charge that Umar can effortlessly bring together in his attempts to capture and stimulate his readership. Activism itself is organic to Umar's substance and style, both. And reading Umar, one finds the famous Gramscian contention reinforced, that even style itself is political and ideological. One can go on and on, charting the manifold trajectories and contributions of Badruddin Umar. My purpose here, admittedly, has not been to reproduce a full-length analytical piece on Umar, but to provide a quick overview of his life and his work, an overview that I think is necessary for the members of our new generation, as well as for others outside Bangladesh, others internationally, others who are interested in Umar's work at a time when bourgeois politics is clearly and even unprecedentedly crisis-ridden. But every overview is inadequate and even highly selective. But I have plans to come up with a book on Umar, since I have realized that his contributions as an intellectual and as a political activist have gone by and large unnoticed. Let me now end with a few observations about Badruddin Umar's personality and character and disposition. Unusually courageous and uncompromising and principled, as he always has been, Badruddin Umar has never sought in his life power in the establishment and cheap comforts in his life. Simplicity and straightforwardness and honesty are the true hallmarks of Badruddin Umar. And also mark this, it is none but Badruddin Umar who could reject, as he did, prize after prize after prize, and the prestigious one, prestigious within quote marks, and the prestigious ones at that, including the Bangla Academy Prize and the Ekushe Padak, and before that, the Bangladesh Itihas Parishad Prize, and so on, telling us rightly that prizes are never innocent vis-a-vis the power of bourgeois mainstream institutions. Badruddin Umar thus turns out to be a classic threat to all those sellouts, all those corrupt intellectuals who never tire of licking the boots of either major generals or even third-rate bureaucrats in our country. And certainly he is a model of oppositionality, integrity, and dignity in a country where compromise and opportunism continue to be deemed the qualities of the fittest and the smartest. Finally, what is important for me, as I had the privilege of working with Umar rather closely in my capacity, as I already pointed out, as the General Secretary of Bangladesh Lekhok Shibir, is Badruddin Umar's dream, alive and untrammeled as it is by odds and adversaries, the dream of a new Bangladesh, where its people are totally liberated from all forces of exploitation and oppression. In fact, on his 89th birthday, I think I already dedicated a poem to him in an op-ed piece that appeared in the pages of the Daily Star, and I will take the opportunity to dedicate that poem. A short poem by his own favorite poet and his comrade, the great Marxist Urdu poet Faiz Ahmed Faiz, a poem that I myself translated into English, a poem whose injunction is already realized in the life and work of Badruddin Umar. And here is the poem, Hoya's poem in my English translation. It's called Speak. Speak, your lips are free. Speak, it is your own tongue. Speak, it is your own body. Speak, your life is still yours. See how in the blacksmith shop the flame burns wild, the iron glows red, the locks open their jaws, and every chain begins to break. Speak, this brief hour is long enough before the death of body and tongue. Speak, cause the truth is not dead yet. Speak, speak, whatever you must speak. Thank you. That's all. Thank you.